Last Friday in the month of Ramadan was marked as International Al-Quds Day by Imam Ruhollah Al-Khomeini, the founder and the late leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran. His aim was to keep Al-Quds in the hearts and minds of all Muslims worldwide who marched to proclaim their support for the free nation of Palestine. This day usually sees millions of Muslim and non-Muslim pro-Palestine supporters march throughout the world capitals calling for the freedom and the return of the free nation of Palestine from the river to the sea after 72 years of occupation and oppression by the Israeli regime. However, pro-Palestine activists across the world are making plans to replace street rallies with online events to commemorate this year's International Al-Quds Day as the coronavirus pandemic restricts social life and mass gatherings across the globe. International Al-Quds Day is the day of the Palestinian refugees inside Palestine and abroad. It's the day of the resistant and besieged Gaza. It's the day of the Palestinian resistance and all its movements. It's the day of every resilient and steadfast person against the Zionist scheme in the region. The annual event is seen as an opportunity for freedom-seeking people across the world, regardless of faith, to voice their support for the Palestinian cause and vent their anger against the apartheid regime of Israel, which has been occupying Palestinian territory since 1948. Some so-called Muslim governments in West Asia and Western states may support Israel all the way, but Al-Quds is a reminder that the people have never forgotten Palestine and never will. And by the words of Imam Khomeini himself, Al-Quds Day is a universal day. It is not an exclusive day for Quds itself. It's a day for the oppressed to rise and stand up against the arrogant. Welcome to the Mideastream. I'm Marwa Osman. Pro-Palestine activists across the world are making plans to replace street rallies with online events to commemorate this year's International Quds Day as the coronavirus pandemic has restricted social life and mass gatherings across the globe. How will this year's Quds Day affect Palestine? To discuss this issue with us from Montreal is Susanna Khalil, political scientist and researcher, founder of the Canaan Association and host and producer of the radio show Palestine 11,000 Years of History. Thank you very much for being with us, Ms. Susanna. Now, to begin with, this year, International Al-Quds Day is different from any year due to the global pandemic of the coronavirus and the lockdown that has stopped people from marching for a free Palestine. This led a lot of activists to go virtual, to go online and start a campaign with hashtags like hashtag fly the flag, for example, to face the continuous brutal Israeli aggression and occupation against Palestine and to call for a freedom of Palestine and the Palestinians. How effective do you think this campaign, given the fact that this year we will not be seeing millions of people flocking the streets all across the world?
Yes, thanks for having me. And of course, and obviously, regarding the situation, virus, people are gonna looking for alternative. The virtual and internet is going to be an alternative to manifest, to express this struggle for justice for Palestine against this colonialism, this atrocity against Palestinian people. And this is also a message for peace, for justice against any terrorism, against any this fascism that we are living in our time. But even if people are looking for another alternative, virtual alternative, it's starting because definitely it's not the same when we see the millions of people protesting and expressing solidarity for Palestinian against this colonialism, and that is different. And I would like to talk about this legacy, which has the day of Al-Quds, day of Jerusalem, which started around 40 years ago and still remain, and it's growing up because I think, for example, we can now see it's not only in Iran or in the Middle East and in the Arab world, and that we can see it in North America or Latin America or in Africa or in Europe, and that this is growing up, and that we can see how start to be involved in the Al-Quds Day, the Jerusalem Day, and that which is very interesting because this is the meeting the different people, but at the same time we are agree against this fascist state. This colonialism, and this is very interesting, and that we have to celebrate that, how they still remain this day, and I will be very happy to see all kind of people we share this point of the liberation of Palestine.
Well, Ms. Khalil,
allow me to express something. This year, in occasion of this commemoration of Al-Quds Day and Jerusalem Day, because we are in the 21st century, and how come we are still talking about colonialism? This Israel that was imposed from Europe in 1948 is a classic colonialism, and this is the most retrograde issue in our time. How come we are talking about democracy, freedom, feminism, and we are talking about human rights, and we ignore this reality of classic retrograde anachronism of colonialism?
Well, Ms. Susanna, if I can stop you for a second and ask you about this day, what it really means for Palestine. International Quds Day is, as you said, is seen as a legacy. It was started by Imam Ruhollah al-Khomeini, who is the founder of the Islamic Republic of Iran and the leader back in 1979. Shortly after the success of the revolution, he started Al-Quds Day to keep Palestine in mind, and he named it the last Friday of Ramadan. Every year, the last Friday would be Al-Quds Day. How do you think this has benefited Palestine, or has it in any way?
No, this is a good opportunity. This is expression, is a tool of in this struggle for liberation against colonialism, and definitely. But as I told you before, it started from 40 years ago. I think around 40 years ago, and in 1979. But it still remains, which is very important, you know, and it's growing up around the world, which is the awareness of people for justice for Palestine, for justice of humanity. It concerns all human beings. It's not also an issue of Palestinian. It's an issue of justice, of a human being, of human condition. And the day of Al-Quds is more than to say, is not a simple city. Is for justice, is against this colonialism, is against imperialism, is against this fascism, and of course it's going to be an opportunity for all Palestinian Arab also, because in this tragedy of Palestinian tragedy, face this brutality of the colonialism is also against humanity, it's against all Arab world also. And
let us tell the world a bit about what Israel has been doing, especially in the last couple of weeks, when the Israeli occupation forces increased their aggression again against Palestinians, especially in the occupied West Bank. They sniped and killed a 14-year-old kid in Tul Karam. And as a Palestinian human rights activist and a researcher and a person who is very well knowledgeable about what's going on in Palestine, how do you assess the silence of the international community, on top of which is the silence of the United Nations itself, when we see such atrocities and incremental genocide against the people of Palestine?
Because we are living in the international order, which is not really honest concerning human rights. Because they are talking about democracy, is a fake democracy. Because we are still attributed in this atrocity of colonialism and imperialism. I insist, we cannot talk about human rights, justice, and freedom, and if we don't face the reality of colonialism and imperialism. That's the reality. That's why international community, they're gonna still continue in silence, because they support they support imperialism. They support this colonialism against the Palestinian people, and that's the answer, Marwa, about that. And when, for example, when now the colonial regime of Israel is doing atrocity, they are doing their job. What is their job? The extermination of Palestinian native. Now we see that the President Donald Trump will want to talk about annexation of the rest of the historic Palestine. We don't have to press. That's what they don't want. They want to expel Palestinian, to expel all Palestinian native from their own land, and they want extermination of Palestinian people. You're going to see, for example, how Europe going to the condemnation of the annexation, but it's only blah blah, it's only condemnation, but they don't want to take action. That's the point. That's the point, that we are still under this international order, which is not honest. It's not really concerning human rights. It's not concerning democracy and freedom, because they are still talking in that we are still atrophied in this atrocity, this atrophy of colonialism, of imperialism.
Susanna, when we began...
This is totally retrograde. And that we have to thank Iran for this commemoration, for this initiative, and that to resist against the colonialism, to fight, to struggle for sovereignty, to struggle for the Arab and Persian people. And now I'm so glad to see this unification between Arab, Persian. I'm so proud about that. Me too, as an Arab and as a Palestinian, I'm Persian too, and they are Arab too because they are Persian. And my message is for them to be united. Even our difference, to be united against colonialism, against Zionism, against imperialism.
Well, Susanna, when we began, we spoke about how the coronavirus is stopping Al-Quds Day from spreading all across the world capitals, and we also see that since the coronavirus began, for about 4 months now, Israel has been exploiting this pandemic by growing illegal settlements in the West Bank, by expanding more, taking more of the Palestinian lands, and aggression, increasing the aggression against the Palestinian people as well. What are the prospects of this plan of annexation? How do you see it going forward?
I'm not impressed. Because from the beginning, this is the reason, the logic of Zionism, to expel Palestinians, to make disappear Palestinian people. We don't have to. That's why I believe now more than ever that we have to talk about one state solution, one state, and the historical Palestine, two states. This is a fraud. This is a fiasco. This is a fake, and this is kind of colonialism too. So that's why I think this is the moment to express one Palestine, from the river to the sea, for the freedom against colonialism. And I insist that this is total retrograde. If we believe in democracy, human rights, and freedom, and justice, and humanity, if we are humanistic, we have to fight colonialism. We have to fight this fascist regime. They are killing, and they are killing a lot of people. They are taking profit of this coronavirus. Marwa, they are doing their job. What is their job? They are fascist. They are supremacist, and they need to make it to end with Palestinian native. That's why we have to resist and condemn them.
I raise my voice next to yours, Susanna Khalil, political scientist and researcher, founder of the Canaan Association, and host and producer of the radio show Palestine 11,000 Years of History. I raise my voice next to yours. Thank you very much for being with us to talk about International Al-Quds Day going virtual. Please stay tuned for our next segment. Israel's repression of Palestinian citizens in the occupied West Bank and Gaza has become more brutal over time. Ethnic cleansing, land seizure, home demolition, military occupation, bombing of Gaza, and international law violations led activists of the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa to declare that the treatment of Palestinians reminded them of the apartheid they endured, fought, and ended. Apartheid Israel increases hostilities in this following report. Under Trump's deal of the century, much like black people in apartheid South Africa, Palestinians will be physically, politically, and emotionally separated and controlled. The map that both Trump and Netanyahu proudly presented while announcing the ominous plan to the world might be a perfect plan to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict if the only two stakeholders were Americans and Israelis. However, for everyone else, the map looked disturbingly familiar. It was a look-alike map of Bantustan and apartheid South Africa. Bantustan or Bantu homelands were former territories designated by the white-dominated apartheid regime of South Africa as quasi-independent homelands to settle majority black Africans. Bantustans were a major administrative tool for the territorial and political separation of racial groups, specifically the exclusion of blacks from the white-dominated political system under the apartheid regime. Through the implementation of the Land, Self-Government and Citizenship Acts, the indigenous black people who made up at least 75% of South Africa were disfranchised, uprooted, treated as subhuman, labeled as foreign, and forcibly relocated to non-contiguous, densely populated, underdeveloped Bantustan territories. Much like Bantustan, according to the Israeli plan, the Palestinians will be given autonomy in those areas over civil matters like education and healthcare. But the critical areas of administration, such as trade, security, and external relations, will be under Israeli control. Under the plan, Israel, like the apartheid regime in South Africa, will maintain unlimited security and military control over Palestinian areas. Moreover, the Israeli regime will control Palestinian borders, airspace, and maritime territories. Similar to South Africa's white-dominated apartheid regime, Trump's plan defines Israel, a state that rules and occupies more Muslim Palestinians than Israeli Jews, as a Jewish state. The plan also recognizes the illegal annexation of the Jordan Valley and illegal Jewish settlements in the West Bank. Hence, according to this plan, Israel is as much of an apartheid as South Africa once was. To discuss this issue with us in an exclusive interview is Mr. Barry Gilder, who is the South African ambassador to Syria and Lebanon. Thank you very much, Mr. Barry, for being with us. It's an honor having you with us on Press TV to talk about how Palestine is very similar to South Africa, your homeland. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu recently said Israel is not a state of all its citizens. Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people and them alone. When you hear that, does it resonate back to the apartheid South Africa era?
Hi, Mawa. Good to be speaking to you. Thanks very much. That statement reminds me of something that was said by the notorious architect of apartheid, Hendrik Verwoerd, way back when he said that Africans in South Africa are no good except as hewers of wood and drawers of water. In other words, they were there to provide their manual labor to white South Africa. And he said that in the context of the education system, implying it was no good educating Africans beyond the task of hewing wood and drawing water. So of course, there are a lot of similarities in your introductory remarks. You mentioned many of those structural, economic, and physical, geographical similarities, including in particular the creation of what were called homelands of Bantustans in South Africa, which were given nominal independence, which seems to me what the so-called deal of the century is trying to propose.
Well, Mr. Barry, a growing number of diplomats worldwide are taking positions opposing the Israeli policies against Palestinians. Many are supporting the Palestinian-led boycott, divestment and sanctions BDS movement, which is deemed in certain countries as anti-Semitism. It's a peaceful mobilization inspired by the movement that helped to end apartheid in South Africa. However, as I told you, many get labeled as anti-Semites just for standing with Palestinians and supporting the freedom of Palestine. As a diplomat, how do you respond to that?
I'm not sure if I should respond as a diplomat or somebody who was involved in the struggle against apartheid. because it reminds me that our liberation movement, the African National Congress, used to tell us during the struggle days that our enemy is not white people, our enemy is the system of apartheid. There were a number of white people involved in the struggle against apartheid. Obviously, you can see I was one of them. But more importantly, there are a lot of Jewish people in South Africa, in Israel, in other parts of the world who support the BDS movement. I'm not sure how you call a Jewish person anti-Semite. Those who criticize Zionism are criticizing the policies, the apartheid policies of Israel, not the religion or the nationality of Jewish people.
Well, taking from that and from what is happening in the world, especially during this pandemic, there's a very nice book that I had the pleasure of reading, which you kindly gifted to me. It's from the ANC's military camps in Angola to Moscow for spycraft training, to the underground in Botswana, and into leadership positions in the administration of the new government in South Africa. Your book, Songs and Secrets, South Africa from Liberation to Governance, which I had the pleasure of reading. It explores the personal, the political, the psychological, and the historical realities that actually gave birth to the new South Africa. Going back through that journey, Mr. Barry, is there anything you regret doing, or at least might have done a bit differently?
I can't think of one thing I regret doing. Of course, there's lots of things we would have done differently if we'd known then what we know now, but that is hindsight. At the time, we understood who our enemy was, we understood global dynamics that on the one hand protected our enemy and on the other hand supported our struggle. So I have nothing to regret, even though I spent 15 years in exile, spent time in the ANC's military camps in Angola. I don't regret anything.
Well, if you take us on that journey for a bit for our audience to learn a bit about your book before actually purchasing it and reading it, because it's such a nice journey to read about when we are living in a world of mainstream media that focuses on what their policies want, what the policies of the mainstream media is versus what happened on the ground. If you take us on one of the journeys, which one actually reminds you of the struggle so hard that you keep seeing and viewing wherever you go?
Gosh, that's a difficult question to answer, Marwa. I think the happiest time, to be honest, it might sound strange, of my exile was in the military camps of the ANC in Angola. Simple reason that we were a community. We had one goal in mind, and we shared that goal, and no matter your ethnic background, your racial background, your religious background, we shared that one goal, and there was an incredible feeling of solidarity, of community. And that lasted way beyond that time, and even into the present. People who shared that time remain very close, and I think that was one part of the journey that has stuck with me, that comradeship, camaraderie, and that sense of common purpose. The modern world has made that a lot more difficult, finding common purpose, the struggle of the 20th century, national liberation struggles, class struggles, the gender struggles of the 20th century have become quite confusing and dissipating as imperial powers assert their dominance on the globe and on the region in particular.
Well, when you remember all of these times, these historic times that you went through in order to see your country freed at last, liberated, how do you feel when you see that the Palestinians have been struggling for 72 years now, and whenever they want to voice their struggle, they get pushed down, aggressed upon, and called terrorists?
I was also called a terrorist. Nelson Mandela was called a terrorist. In fact, Nelson Mandela was still on the American list of terrorists when he went on a state visit to the USA. There's a difference between terrorism as we know it today and national liberation struggle. In my discussions with the Palestinian organizations here in Damascus, the Palestinian embassy back home in South Africa and elsewhere, I think the key lesson, especially at this time of this so-called deal of the century, the key lesson is the need for unity. Of course, there are always differences in strategy, tactics, and approach. But when you have an enemy as determined and strong as that one south of this border, you need to unite, you need to mobilize all your forces, politically and otherwise, to have a chance of success. Well, that you need, as we did with the struggle, united people across also ideological and other divides, which was what was the basis for our success.
Unfortunately, we are out of time. It was such a pleasure, and I hope to have you again to talk more about the journey to the liberation of South Africa, in our hopes that Palestine will once in this lifetime see the liberation that South Africa saw. I want to thank you very much, Mr. Barry Gilder, South Africa Ambassador to Syria and Lebanon, for joining us. And please stay tuned next week for more from the Mideastream.
Thank you.